took him and loaded him up on a ship so that he could leave, and he traveled there from Athens. And that's where we come to our verse, number 15. Acts 17:15 reads, "And they that conducted Paul," that is, the disciples that went with him, secured him passage and traveled with him, conducted Paul, brought him unto Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for them to come with all speed, they departed. And so Paul, as he is departing from the ship and from these brethren that escorted him there, he urges them to please send Timothy and Silas, who he left back in Thessalonica. Please send them, ask them to come post haste. And so now let's talk about Athens for just a few moments. Athens is a major location. In fact, first of all, here we have the map. Let's see, Paul was at Philippi, then he went to traveling through Amphipolis and Apollonia. He came to Thessalonica. He left Thessalonica to Berea, where the Jews came there and stirred up trouble as well. And he presumably went by ship. I guess he could have traveled by foot, but that would have been a several weeks' journey, whereas only a few days' journey by ship. Most likely, the Bible doesn't tell us exactly how he traveled, but most likely he traveled by ship down to Athens. And so here is a picture of Athens. This is a modern-day picture of Athens. Most of it is in ruins, but there is still a thriving city, around the ruins here. And so I want to read to you some things that I have found in commentaries and other books concerning this location of. This statement here comes from the Bible Dictionary. I believe I got it from Winton. Well, first of all, before I make that comment, I have in my notes that Athens was one of the 4 greatest cities of the Roman Empire. The greatest 4 cities of the Roman Empire were Rome, Alexandria, Athens, and Jerusalem. There were no larger, more populated cities, and so major location here. Excuse me. Now, Bob Winton quotes International Bible Dictionary in describing this city, and he says, quote, "The city was a plain extending to the sea on the southwest, where it had 3 ports, the passage to which was defended by long and broad walls. Several rocky hills rose in the plain," and please notice this is one of these rocky, this is the Areopagus I'll mention in a minute, and there was another hill over here, and there was another hill here, and these hills were very important locations within this city. These hills were where business was conducted, where speakers addressed common assemblies. This main one, the Areopagus here, was a fortified part of the city, and so this city was was built in this location, obviously with these geographic features in mind. They played well into the prominence of Athens. Picking back up at Winton says, "Several rocky hills arose in the plain, the largest of which was the citadel," right in the center of the picture on the screen, or the Acropolis. Around this city was built most of the buildings spreading towards the sea. The summit of the hill was nearly level, about 800 feet long, 400 feet wide. A small valley lay between the Acropolis and the hill on which the Areopagus held its sessions. I want to stop right here. And this is the Areopagus. This is where the the government took place, where official rulings were decreed, and where court trials took place. This is the place where Paul will eventually be later on in the text. It's called the Acropolis. Also, in some versions of the text, it's referred to as Mars Hill. I'll explain that later on. And so he says, continues, "A small valley lay between the Acropolis and the hill on which the Areopagus held its sessions. It also separated the Areopagus from the Pnyx. This hill over here is called the Pnyx. And the Pnyx was a small rocky hill on which the general assemblies of the people were held. Here the spot is yet pointed out from which the eminent orators addressed the people. It is cut in the natural rock. In this vicinity was also the agora, or marketplace, in Acts 17. I believe the agora was in this. I tell you what, looky here. Forgot I had this. So here's the hill of Pnyx. Here is the Acropolis on which the famous Parthenon stood and other structures. Over here is the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, and these other interesting ruins do not come out in the text. Here the spot is yet pointed out from which the eminent orators, that is the Areopagus, Mars Hill, addressed the people. It is cut in the natural rock. In this vicinity was also the agora, the marketplace, Acts 17:17. An open square surrounded by beautiful structures, while on every side altars, shrines, and temples were seen. Some of them were exceedingly magnificent. It was the very flower of ancient civilization. Its schools of philosophy were the most illustrious in the world, and its painters, sculptors, and architects have never been surpassed. Yet no city was so wholly given to idolatry. Those words from, again, International Bible Dictionary. I found them as quoted by Bob Winton. By the way, just a reminder, Bob Winton's commentaries, you can get the whole set for free on GBN's website. Garrett, we were talking about that the other day, and I forgot. GBN's website, they bought the rights. You can go download them all for free. Roper says of Athens, quote, many of the greatest thinkers, orators, and artists who ever lived made Athens their home. The concept of democracy had been born there. In the process of conquering the world, Alexander the Great and later the Romans spread the Athenian culture and Greek language throughout the world. Athens was still considered, in Paul's day, by many to be the greatest of 3 university cities in the world at that time. The other 2 were Alexandria in Egypt and Paul's hometown, Tarsus of Cilicia. And so those 3 cities were like the Harvard, the Yale, and the Princeton, or the biggest, or Cambridge in England. You know, that's somewhat how these cities were looked at, the education centers of the world. It was from Athens that Paul's going to spend some time here in this location. And it was from Athens that Paul wrote the first epistle of the Bible, that all the epistles we have addressed to the churches in the New Testament, the oldest one is 1 Thessalonians, and it was from this location that Paul wrote it. And so I think now of course I mentioned that we also have an epistle recorded right there in Acts chapter 15, if we're not counting that one. 1 Thessalonians is the oldest. And what might Paul have said to the Thessalonians? Well, the primary purpose of the book of Thessalonians was, 1, to defend his conduct against the false charges that were brought against him while he was there in Thessalonica. 2, to encourage the brethren if they should also face persecution. And 3, to remind them of the future hope that is in Jesus Christ. And so I think it's a good tactic, a worthwhile effort to, as you're studying the book of Acts, maybe take the time to read the epistles that Paul writes in the context that he wrote them. You know, as we're familiar with the things that are going on, and now we know what happened to him there in Thessalonica, and now he's just a few cities away and he writes them. You know, that's a perfect context to go read the book in. You know, it can help us to understand things, you know, like Brother West used to say regarding the book of Revelation, viewing things through 21st century glasses. It helps us to put us in the shoes of Paul and understand better the things he wrote and why he wrote them. So this brings us to the next section on our outline. Back to our outline here. Next section of our outline, verses 16 through 21, to Athens. Paul's spirit is stirred. It says verse 16, Now while Paul waited for them in Athens, his spirit was stirred within him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. And so that phrase in the King James, his spirit was stirred within him, that simply is to say that he was greatly distressed by what he saw. Paul looked around, saw all these idols, and when we think about all the idols that he saw, there would have been more. It would have been more than just these stone, these amazingly beautiful structures. That wouldn't necessarily be all that that bothered him. But if there's altars and these pagan altars and idols, what by necessity, what also will be included? People worshiping these idols and altars, people participating in some of the very immoral practices that were associated with the worship of those gods, like immorality, specifically fornication, homosexuality, infanticide, things like that. And so these are things that Paul probably witnessed in the time that I don't know how he wouldn't have seen them. I don't know how he could have possibly went into a city described as one wholly given over to idolatry and not witnessed such things. And so this stuff absolutely disgusted Paul. According to this statement, a city wholly given to idolatry, one writer, H. Leo Bowles, page 276 of his commentary, said, "This statement is no exaggeration. Protonius, satirically, he was a statesman. He wrote satires. He said it was easier to find a god than a man in Athens." Maybe a little hyperbole there, but at any rate, we get the point. Xenophon called the city one great altar, one great offering to the gods. And so this statement, a city wholly given to idolatry, is no exaggeration, according to Bowles. Paul's distress, again, would have been not only these idols, but the practices that are taking place in relation to these idols. And Paul, well, we know what kind of man Paul is. Is Paul going to just sit back and say nothing about all this? No. Paul's going to hit it head on. And so verse 17, Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons and in the market daily with them that met with him. Boy, Paul, he's by himself now, as far as we know. We know Luke has been left behind in Philippi. We know Silas and Timothy have been left behind in Thessalonica. Maybe somebody else is with him, but if so, we don't know of it. And is Paul going to be a little meek and scared by himself? No. Not only does he go to the synagogue and reason with the Jews there, but he also goes to the agora, and he's meeting with anybody who will have a discussion with him. Verse 18, then, of course, it doesn't take long for that to get the attention of some of the big dogs in town, does it? Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him. And some said, "What will this babbler say?" Or other some, let me paraphrase what that means. Some others said. All right, if you're reading from the King James, that's an awkward way. That's an archaic way language there. Other some. But basically that means some others said. And so some said that what will this babbler say? Some others said, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. Well, as it came out in our description of Athens, our introduction to Athens, Athens was known for its philosophers. The history books, if you was to ask the historian to tell you something about Athens, the philosophers would be in the very first sentence or two about this location. They were known for it. A philosopher is a person who is engaged in the academic pursuit of philosophy. The actual word philosophy means lover of wisdom. And so these were people who loved the pursuit of wisdom, and they engaged in an academic pursuit of it. They were those people who systematically studied thought, reason, and various ideologies, and there's various sects even within the field. We are introduced to two very prominent sectarian groups among the philosophers here in this chapter, the Epicureans and the Stoics. So now let's have somewhat of an introduction to these. Conybeare and Hawson, in their book, The Life and Epistles of St. Paul, said of the Epicureans, quote, "They were named after Epicurus, 342 to 270 BC, who founded this system. In their view, the world was formed by an accidental concourse of atoms, a Big Bang, maybe, and was not in any sense created or even modified by the divinity. They did indeed profess a certain belief in what were called gods, probably more to accommodate the rest of their culture than anything, but these equivocal deities were merely phantoms, impressions upon the popular mind, dreams which had no real objective reality, or at least they exercised no active influence in the physical world or the business of life. The essential principle of the Epicurean philosopher was that there was nothing to alarm him. Nothing to disturb him. He would probably really like that phrase that's popular in our day, no fear. You know, that could be a motto for the Epicureans. His furthest reach was to deliberately do what the animals do instinctively. His highest aim was to gratify himself. With the coarser and more energetic minds, this principle inevitably led to the grossest sensuality and crime. In the case of others, whose temperament was more commonplace or whose taste was more pure, the system took a form of selfishness more refined. And so when you think about that mindset and think about people today who might have a similar mindset, to me that sounds like the atheist community. They don't really believe in gods, or if they do say anything about the gods, then it's only accommodative language, just to be somewhat tolerant of others. But really, they don't believe in any. They believe that the universe came from what did Conybeare and Hawson say? That they believed that the universe was created by some accidental concourse of atoms. Kind of sounds like the Big Bang Theory to me. And so what the atheistic community believes today isn't all that new, is it? This is something that goes a way back. And when we think about this kind of person with this kind of mind, and what does atheism lead to? Self-gratification. There's no rules, do whatever you want. And that's exactly what it led these people to do. And so, how receptive do you think this audience is going to be to Paul? Probably not very receptive at all. Now let's look at this other group called the Stoics. The Stoics, they took their name from the place where their founder Zeno taught, the Stoa. The Stoa is a painted porch. Let me see if you can happen to see the ruin. This is the ruins of a Stoa, I believe, right here. You may have seen in maybe some movies about ancient Rome, a porch with a red tiled roof covering it, and some of them would be really long. Those were Stoas. All right, and so this group took their name from the place where their founder Zeno taught, from the Stoa, or the painted porch. Zeno taught that God was the soul of the world, or the world was God. That everything was, now I just stop right there, and can you think of some people today that have that same view? I don't know if naturalist would be the right word. I'm not really sure, but you hear people talk about Mother Earth all the time. You know, well, Mother Earth, this, that, and the other thing. Same general concept here. Zeno taught that God was the soul of the world, or the world was God, that everything was governed by fate, to which God himself was even subject. They denied the immortality of the soul. The Stoic philosophers taught that virtue was its own reward, and vice was its own punishment, that pleasure was no good, and pain no evil. The Stoics were pantheists. They believe in pantheists and other what's that word? Everything. Theist God. They believe God was in everything. Matter was inseparable from deity. The soul was, in fact, corporal. The Stoics said that at death the soul would be burnt or returned to be absorbed in God. Thus, a resurrection from the dead, in the sense in which the gospel has revealed it, must have appeared to the Stoics as completely irrational. The proud ideal which was set before the disciple of Zeno was a magnanimous, these are not my words, this is Coney Barrett and Hawson, magnanimous self-denial and austere apathy, untouched by human passion, unmoved by circumstance. Nothing could be more contrary to the spirit of Christianity. Christianity is the school of humility. Stoicism is the education of pride. Christianity is a discipline of life. Stoicism was nothing better than apprenticeship for death. The Stoics were the origin of our English word stoic, which is defined as a person who can endure pain or hardship without showing their feelings or complaining. And that's kind of essentially what the ideology of the Stoics were. They had such a pitiful view of the world and life that they just didn't get emotional about anything. They tried to endure pain without showing any emotion. You know, several of the Roman Caesars were Stoics. And so have we been introduced now to these philosophers and these two particular sects within the group of philosophers. And these certain philosophers of the Epicureans and the Stoics encountered him, and some said, "What will this babbler say?" The word babbler is from the Greek word spermologos, combination of sperma, which means seed, and lego, which means to collect. And so what they're saying is that Paul is a collector of seeds. Says here, it was used primarily as an adjective, but it came to be used as a noun signifying a crow or some other bird picking up seeds. Metaphorically, it came to be used of a man who picks up scraps of information and retells them secondhand. In other words, a plagiarist, or one who would make a show in unscientific style of knowledge obtained from misunderstanding lectures. They're not complimenting Paul in any way. Their view of Paul is this man must have sat down at a lot of lectures and pieced a whole bunch of stuff he's gathered from different speakers together and created something entirely new. And this seems to be somewhat comical to them. They seem to be wanting to make sport of Paul. It seems their primary interest in Paul was to make sport of him, along with they had some casual interest in his views, not what we would consider good soil, not at all. But why is Paul dealing with it? If they're not good, with soil this bad, why is Paul even wasting his time? Because they're giving him an opportunity. They're giving him a platform from which he may teach and perhaps reach others. Verses 19 through 21. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, right here, Mars Hill. They took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is? For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean." And then Luke has a parenthetical statement here. He feels the need to explain something to us here. "For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or hear some new thing." And so these are your TikTok followers of the first century. They're just amazed by some new thing to hear. And that's what they spend all their time doing. All right? Now the Areopagus, the Greek word literally means, Areopagus means heel of Ares. Ares was one of the Greek gods, but the Romans had a counterpart to all the Greek gods. The Roman counterpart for Ares was Mars. Therefore, that's why in some of your Bibles you will read Mars Hill, whereas others you will read Areopagus. Both terms are correct. Just depends on whether you're looking at it from the viewpoint of a Greek or from a Roman. Of course, the first language that the Bible was translated into from the Greek was what? Latin, by the Roman Catholic Church. And so those translations who took the Latin Vulgate and then translated that into English are going to probably have Mars Hill. Whereas those who go back to the original Greek are probably going to translate Areopagus. Again, the Areopagus or Mars Hill was a prominent rock outcropping where in classical times the Athenian governing body met. Cases were tried here. Judgments were handed down from this location. However, by the first century, only certain types of cases were tried here. It wasn't quite as prominent as it once were, but there were still trials that were related to religious matters, which is why Paul was carried to this location. This is a formal gathering. Paul's views, you might say, are being placed on trial here. This would be an uncomfortable situation if I were there. Tell you. I'm being carried before the authorities to tell about my religious views. I could suffer for this. That's nothing new to Paul, though. So Paul was apparently unafraid. The great orators, politicians, and philosophers would assemble at this place to discuss and debate their various philosophies. The interest the philosophers had in the doctrine Paul preached was only surface curiosity. It was only a new and different idea that amused these philosophers momentarily. Luke informs us in verse 21 in that parenthetical statement that this was the basic characteristic of Athenians, to tell or learn something new. And this might explain, if we think about it, this might explain why certain groups that we see today, like miracle workers and millennialists, why people who their doctrines are in such disharmony with Scripture. We wonder, why in the world do people follow them? I would suggest that maybe the people who follow them have the same mindset as the Athenians. They're always looking for some new, exciting thing to follow. We have to be aware of that. We have to be aware that we don't get caught up in this end times stuff that's so prevalent today, and these miraculous things and just spectacles that just serve as a distraction, that Satan wants us to distract us from following the truth of God's Word. I've often had discussions with people who it quickly became, at first I was very excited because this person seems really interested, and so I get excited. But in the course of teaching them, it doesn't take me long to realize that their interest is only a casual interest. They're just kind of excited to hear something new, but anytime I start talking about doctrine and the things and how to apply this to their life and be better for it, you can tell this is blank look, and there's no interest. I usually don't spend too much time with such individuals once that becomes apparent. This brings us to verses 22 through 34. Yes, ma'am. Areopagus.
And said, we want to hear what you have to say because philosophers were searching for wisdom, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
And he went, anticipating that they would scoff. There might even be confrontations. They might even be a hostile bunch. But he went knowing that this place was also not necessarily for for law or passing judgment,
Mm-hmm.
but just to discuss because, there were philosophers there. I mean, this is the way I like to think about this, is that, there
Colossians 4:6, is that what you're turning to?
Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt,
Mm-hmm.
so that you will know how you should respond to each person.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I think of that as he prepares to go to Mars Hill and he preaches because he's so diplomatic and he does address the fact that there's some of them are searching. They're wanting to address all those gods that they think are out there.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Am I just totally incorrect in
No, I think
preparing for this?
there's, of course, we're not given the mindset of Paul in Scripture, so all that we can do is just surmise what it may have been. But I think knowing Paul like we do, we can make some good estimations. I imagine, first of all, going into this Areopagus among the Greeks is almost just like going into the synagogue for the Jews. You go into the, go ahead.
But do you think the way that I interpret this is that he wasn't forced, he wasn't dragged into this setting, but he was welcomed.
Right, right.
He was taken there and welcomed and given an opportunity to tell people.
Mm-hmm.
So, it wasn't like he was from a jail.
Right, right.
Or, but
And if I implied that he was being carried against his will, I didn't mean to. I think I'm just saying that to me it would have been intimidating. This would have been an intimidating situation, knowing that now I'm going from having personal Bible studies on the street and just having casual conversation to now I'm standing before the Senate giving my views on this. That's intimidating. But I think Paul saw this as a great opportunity. Like if the Southern Baptists asked me to come to the Southern Baptist Convention and speak to them, I'm going. Am I going to be intimidated? Yes. But I'm going because it's an opportunity. Greg?
I kind of always view this setting where their entertainment was academic,
Mm-hmm.
but none of it was really intended to change them. It was just the fun of learning. So it's me cruising on the TV, checking out different channels. Oh, this looks interesting. I think I'll watch this.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to react to it. And so the Epicureans who ultimately were all about whatever pleases me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not interested in you telling me what to do. I'm interested in how I can advance my own personal pleasure. Stoics
Excuse me.
stuck in that everything's inevitable, so it really doesn't matter what I do. They were looking for somebody to tell them something to do. And ultimately, what we find from Paul's sermon or his presentation, there's a reaction that he's asking for, and that's why they reject it. They're not interested in learning to then follow. It's just the fun of learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's the intellectual curiosity. And so it's different from Thessalonica, which the Jews were threatened with this presentation of Jesus, because it threatened their old religious belief system. They attacked Paul
Mm-hmm.
in response. These people didn't attack because that's not what they're interested in. They're interested in interested in a good story,
Mm-hmm.
interesting thoughts. They're very academic. There's no ultimate reaction like we have to convince me because
Right.
everybody has a good argument.
Well, in the text, two different views at least are brought out. One, some people are just refer to him as a babbler, and those people who refer to him as a babbler, they're they're obviously there to ridicule, there to make fun, make sport of Paul. But then others, the other group, seem to have at least a little more interest in what he has to say. I imagine Paul, when he spoke, he came across as an educated man. After all, he was from the city of from Tarsus of Cilicia, one of the big university cities of the Roman Empire. He was trained up at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the most preeminent men of the Jewish synagogue. Paul had to sound intelligent, and so I believe there was some sincere interest in hearing what he had to say. Now, whether or not they wanted to do anything about it, I don't think they had any intentions whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Right. So how do you begin a speech to a group like that? That's what we're going to talk about next. We don't really have time to get into that very much right now. Class is over, but how do you approach a group like that? You can't use your normal tactics. You wouldn't want to give the history of God's dealings with Israel like Paul generally does in the synagogues of the Jews. That's not going to have any effect on them. Reasoning from the Scriptures with them of how Christ is the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies, that's not going to have any sway over these people. And so, what approach do you use? Well, Paul really is brilliant. He starts where the people are. You know, that's what we have to learn to do to be good evangelists. We have to learn where our prospect is and start there. Where are they? Well, they at least, with a city wholly given over to idolatry, they at least entertain the idea of some gods. And so that's where he starts. As I was in your city, I perceived that you are very religious or too superstitious, one version says. And I also noticed while I was coming into town here that you got an idol over here that says to the unknown God. So you at least entertain the idea that there might even be gods that you're not aware of. That's who I want to talk to you about. Absolutely brilliant approach, if you ask me. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. I don't really have time to get into any more of the thoughts. I think the bell's ringing any second anyway. So we'll go ahead and dismiss. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your comments. We're dismissed.